The political earthquake that just shook Ottawa to its core? It wasn't a surprise. It was an inevitability. For years, he was the government's climate shield, the former Greenpeace activist, the man who once scaled the CN Tower in protest, Stephen Guilbeault. But he was never destined to last in Mark Carney's cabinet. Because last week, the Prime Minister signed a deal, a single memorandum of understanding with Alberta, that was so radically opposed to every principle Guilbeault had spent his life fighting for. It forced his hand. It was the moment pragmatism turned into betrayal. This is the story of a political time bomb, an explosion of values that was scripted the moment Stephen Guilbeault sat down at the cabinet table and finally detonated over one toxic issue, a brand new heavy oil pipeline to the Pacific. Mark Carney's goal was economic. He wanted to end the decade-long war with Alberta, secure a pathway for Canadian oil to Asia, and diversify the economy. The cost? He agreed to scrap key climate regulations, lift the moratorium on oil tankers off the volatile coast of British Columbia, and push forward a project that has zero Indigenous consent. In his own words, the deal had three major failures. 1. No consultation with Indigenous nations. 2. A pipeline route that cuts through the Great Bear Rainforest. 3. A move that pushes Canada further away from its Paris climate targets. Today on TREN 24 Update, we are breaking down the three seismic political collisions that made Guilbeault's resignation the only possible ending. From his activist past to his final, principal walkout, we're explaining the true cost of Mark Carney's pipeline gambit. His biography is the stuff of radical environmental legend. He co-founded Équiterre, Quebec's largest environmental NGO. He was a Greenpeace director. His fame was cemented when he climbed the CN Tower to protest Canada and the U.S. being branded climate killers. In his home riding of Laurier-Sainte-Marie, his supporters knew him as a bona fide environmentalist, even if he ran for the Liberals. As one Green Party poster ironically put it, voting for Stephen Guilbeault is also voting Green. His entire public identity was defined by purity and uncompromising conviction. But Ottawa has a way of turning firebrands into pragmatists. When he entered federal politics in 2019, Guilbeault found himself cast in a deeply contradictory role. He was the climate champion tasked with selling policies that often infuriated the very movement he came from. Think about the tightrope he walked. He had to defend the purchase of a pipeline, the Trans Mountain expansion, a project that activists view as a climate disaster. He later approved the massive Bay du Nord oil project offshore of Newfoundland, admitting it was particularly challenging on a personal level. He tried to brand himself as a radical pragmatist, a man who swallowed a bitter pill to stay inside the tent, believing he could steer policy toward net zero from a position of power. This was the rationalization many environmentalists reluctantly accepted. Better to have an imperfect environmentalist inside cabinet than no environmentalist at all. But the foundation of his compromises was being chipped away. Under Mark Carney's government, the situation became untenable. Guilbeault watched as the architecture of climate policy he helped build under the previous administration was systematically dismantled. 1. The consumer carbon price, which he had championed as an essential pillar, was scrapped by Carney almost immediately. 2. The federal oil and gas emissions cap was suspended in favor of a deal with Alberta. 3. The crucial clean electricity regulations, designed to decarbonize the grid by 2035, were partially waived for Alberta as part of the new MOU. Each rollback was a compromise, but the Alberta pipeline deal was not a compromise, it was a reversal. The deal essentially cemented a new government philosophy, economic ambition over environmental principle. The tightrope he was walking was completely shredded. Staying in cabinet no longer looked like pragmatism, it looked like surrender. Guilbeault was left with a choice: retain his cabinet post and lose his soul, or walk away and regain his credibility. When Carney and Premier Smith celebrated the new pipeline as a national victory, Guilbeault's conscience made the decision for him. He was out. His moral red lines had been crossed, setting the stage for the second, more painful collision. The new Mark Carney-Danielle Smith agreement was not just about building a pipeline. It was about tearing up three fundamental pillars of Canadian governance and environmental responsibility that Guilbeault believed were non-negotiable. The first pillar, Indigenous sovereignty and consent. Guilbeault explicitly stated his opposition came from a lack of consultation with Indigenous nations on the west coast of British Columbia. This is the new reality of Canada. No major energy project can proceed without Indigenous consent. Before the ink was even dry on the MOU, coastal First Nations leaders were firm. We will never allow oil tankers on our coast, and this pipeline will never happen. For Guilbeault, this was a matter of basic justice. For Carney, it was a political hurdle. Carney's government, in its eagerness to fast-track a project of national interest, was willing to override or circumvent these rights, a move Guilbeault could not tolerate. The silence from a communities most affected by the pipeline route was deafening and telling. The second pillar, coastal and environmental integrity. The proposed pipeline to the Pacific coast means one thing: the lifting of the federal oil tanker moratorium on the narrow, storm-prone northern BC coast. Guilbeault had seen the devastating environmental consequences firsthand. In his resignation, he warned of the catastrophic risk of spills in that highly sensitive region, stating the route could cut through the iconic Great Bear Rainforest. This rainforest is one of the world's ecological treasures, a protected ecosystem. To exempt a major fossil fuel project from the ban meant sacrificing years of environmental protection policy and risking an irreplaceable natural habitat. This was the ultimate line in the sand for the lifelong activist. The third pillar, climate credibility and Paris targets. Carney framed the deal as a necessary economic trade-off, a new pipeline and relaxed regulations in exchange for Alberta agreeing to stronger industrial carbon pricing and supporting the Pathways Alliance carbon capture project. Guilbeault called this trade-off a serious mistake. The simple truth is that a new, privately funded pipeline designed to carry hundreds of thousands of barrels of heavy oil per day to Asia increases overall climate pollution. It makes meeting Canada's commitment to the Paris Agreement vastly harder. Carney's focus on results, not objectives, is a classic business approach, but climate change operates on scientific objectives. Guilbeault knew that losing the emissions cap and waiving the clean electricity regulations meant the government was prioritizing the perception of economic growth over the reality of climate survival. His final stand was not just a protest, it was a warning that the government's ambition and its execution were now dangerously far apart. Guilbeault's cabinet departure stripped the Liberal Party of its single greatest piece of climate credibility, leaving Mark Carney exposed and facing the most difficult part of this crisis, the political fallout. Stephen Guilbeault's resignation is not just a footnote in a political memoir, it is a seismic realignment of Canadian politics. His departure leaves Mark Carney's government politically naked. For years, Guilbeault served as the party's human shield, the unimpeachable environmentalist whose presence signaled that the government, despite approving some oil projects, was fundamentally committed to climate action. Now, without him, Carney owns every compromise. He loses the insulation and credibility that Guilbeault provided, forcing the Prime Minister to defend every policy rollback on his own. The message to voters, particularly in Quebec and British Columbia, is stark. Even the government's own climate champion couldn't stand by this deal. The immediate political risks are multiplying. 1. The BC backlash. Premier David Eby of British Columbia was completely excluded from the negotiations and has been clear. He will not support a new pipeline, and he will not allow new tankers in BC's narrow coastal channels. The Carney deal has pitted two Liberal-aligned provincial governments against each other, threatening the federal party's electoral chances in crucial BC ridings. 2. The Indigenous veto. The fiercest opposition comes from Indigenous nations. This deal may have federal approval, but in modern Canada, that is not enough. The opposition of the coastal First Nations is backed by strong legal precedent regarding their right to consent on their unceded territories. This means that even if Carney clears the political path, Indigenous nations have the power to kill the pipeline in the courts before a single shovel hits the ground. 3. The end of the political experiment. Guilbeault's departure signals the official end of the Red-Green Alliance, the attempt by the Liberal Party to unite economic progressives with environmental activists. Carney's style, focused on business logic, short-term economic results, and an eagerness to use federal power to override local opposition, is diametrically opposed to the slow, consensus-driven, principle-first approach demanded by climate activism. The ultimate question remains, can a government credibly promise climate leadership while building a brand-new oil pipeline? For Stephen Guilbeault, the answer was a definitive no. He chose the purity of his principles over the power of his office. His resignation is not the end of his story, but the beginning of a new political chapter, potentially returning to his roots as a powerful, nonpartisan voice for climate accountability. As for Mark Carney, the pipeline deal may have secured an uneasy peace with Alberta for now, but the price was losing the most important voice for climate within his own government. The tightrope is gone, the shield is gone, and the political earthquake is just beginning to shake the foundation of his leadership. What side of the climate economy debate do you think Carney made the bigger mistake on? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe to TREN 24 Update for more on the fallout from this national crisis. We'll be tracking the Indigenous legal challenges next week. Stay tuned.